Hello again. Welcome to another edition of Public Affairs, Public Access. I'm your guest host, David Hutzelman, and once a month or so we get together to talk about issues dealing with political philosophy, public policy, and sometimes even delve into some election kind of things. But generally I try to keep the comments on these issues analyzing them from a libertarian perspective. And of course, a lot of people ask me, well, what is a libertarian perspective anyway? And I try to boil that down to the fact that libertarians are generally supporters of the free market, not the over-regulated crony capitalist economy that we have going in the United States today. Strong supporters of personal freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of association, and other issues having to do with civil liberties, and a fairly modest policy in terms of foreign affairs. And most libertarians would like to stay out of the world stage in terms of military engagements and military aggression. Not all libertarians are members of the Libertarian Party. Those are the kind of the capital L libertarians. There's a lot of small L libertarians around. They're sometimes referred to as classical liberals, and they populate the two major parties as well. So when we talk about libertarian issues, it's not strictly for the Libertarian Party, but for public policy in general. And so I have with me a very distinguished gentleman here. He's been on the show before. He's now working, at least temporarily, as a full-time political consultant. It's Charles Blain.
Thanks.
Charles has a degree in political science from Farley Dickinson up in the cold climes of New Jersey. I guess we're not up in New Jersey right now. But anyway, he has also done a lot of work with Empower Texans and has been their Houston representative for some time now. But he's taken some time off to work in the actual trenches of the political warfare. So I've asked him to think about commenting on, there's evidently, although I don't keep up with all the details myself, there's quite a struggle going on from a general standpoint in the Republican primary this year with the fact that Governor Abbott was not able to get much of what he thought was important legislation passed in the last session or in the special agenda. So he's taken a more active role, I guess, in some of the Republican primary issues this time, in hopes, I guess, to build a more of a majority. So Charles has been keeping his finger on that for some time, and maybe he could give us a brief rundown about what are the issues that are seem to be driving this general fray within the Republican Party, Charles.
Yeah, so, well, thanks for having me. And yeah, I am from New Jersey, but it kind of feels like we're in New Jersey with this cold we've been having lately.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, it's interesting. You know, you saw the dynamic during the legislative session of Governor Abbott and Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick and other conservatives in both the House and the Senate pushing for a lot of different reforms like property tax reform, spending reform, union dues reform, school choice, all these different measures. And every time that they thought they were advancing one, issue, they got it through the Senate, it seemed to have gotten thwarted in the House. So that started this divide. Well, it's a divide that's been there for a long time, but it really highlighted that divide this session. So now you're seeing that carry over into the primary season, which is really interesting. As all this back and forth was happening during the regular session, and then we started to see that a special session would have to be called to then fix it, Governor Abbott said that he was making a list of legislators who were standing in the way of a lot of these reforms, and he was going to make sure to follow through on that list in the primary season. And now we're starting to see that.
He's been historically very removed from a lot of these things. He hasn't, I guess, seen fit to go down in and try to identify individual candidates or anything. He's pretty much left public speak about who they wanted and then work with whoever got elected, right?
Yeah, that's been his approach so far. As you know, I moved here in 2014 to work for his first campaign, so I kind of followed his.
Oh, I didn't.
Yeah, I thought
didn't
I may have
realize you
told
were
you
working
that,
for
but
him.
yeah.
No.
So, I followed his first legislative session pretty closely as I started working for Empower Texans at that time, and he was involved in the session, but in that primary, he took the approach that most Texas governors have often taken, which is not to get involved in primaries. And then this time, I guess he just kind of had enough and decided to get involved in primaries because he keeps seeing these a lot of the same people stand in the way of solid reforms that he and others are pushing. So he finally he made the effort and he decided to get involved, to throw his name in the ring and really start fighting for good candidates who he feels will help kind of further this agenda. And it certainly sent shockwaves when he did. Every news outlet from here to Austin was talking about the governor getting involved in primaries, and it seemed to have really shaken things up because people hadn't seen that happen before.
Yeah, well, he seems to have, I mean, I don't look at opinion polls too often, but I think he has a fair amount of support within the state. And I guess if you were a sitting Republican representative from some district and you suddenly found that Governor Abbott had endorsed your opponent in the primary, which is what's happened in a number of cases, I guess the main one being District 134, that's got to be a pretty unnerving experience to do that. So, I mean, of course, he has some favorites to be elected, but even if you weren't elected, you have to worry about the fact that you're kind of on his radar or in his gun sights or whatever it is, even if you're going back to Austin again.
Yeah, well, it certainly puts you on your toes, right? It makes you kind of think about what happened in the past and what's going to happen in the future, whether you return or not. So, I mean, it definitely, I think, opened everyone's eyes, and it changed the I wouldn't say temperature, the atmosphere in the legislature. I think a lot of lawmakers are looking at this and seeing that he is willing to get involved, and that they shouldn't be the ones standing in the way of his or others' reforms, because they might be the ones kind of in that line of sight next time. And I think it's refreshing. I think it's going to do some good going to the legislature next session, because you're going to start to see I hope you start to see solid reforms getting pushed through, or at least getting the chance to be heard, because people are going to know that if they step in front of this legislation that he wants or others want, it might cause an issue. And the thing is, it's not legislation that's anything on the fray. He's pushing things like property tax reform. I mean, he released a paper on his new property tax proposal last week, and he cited that since 1997. Texas property tax collections have increased by like 190% or something along those lines. Absolutely absurd. So these are things that average Texans want to see done. So it's not like he's asking for anything crazy or out of the ordinary. He's just asking for solid reforms that'll benefit everyone.
Well, maybe you could give us a little condensation of what that property tax reform issue that he put out. What does that entail?
Yeah,
I assume it entails a cap on property taxes from some way or other, right? Is there a cap now, or is there not a cap, or are there so many exceptions that it really doesn't make any difference? Or
So I mean, so many exceptions that it certainly feels that every year they're just doing whatever they want to. If you go talk to a lot of these homeowners, and that's what they say, they don't see any of the exemptions that they get or anything like that. They just feel the burden of the increasing tax or the increasing appraisal. So what his proposal would do, I think the biggest part of that proposal that everybody's been talking about, is it would cap the year-over-year growth of property taxes at 2.5%. So that's really limiting how much these local governments can take in. That's your school districts, your MUD districts, your cities, all these local governments. It's really
all those districts, not just school districts.
Right. It's limiting them, and it's good, because I think it's going to make them reevaluate what they're spending on, and kind of prioritize. I mean, Houston has a cap, and unfortunately, it hasn't worked as great as we wanted it to, because the city still spends and attempts to get around that cap when possible, and different things like that. But we're hoping to see that
create another TERS.
Right, create another, exactly.
Put some money through there.
Try to be nice about it. You just can't. Yeah, create another TERS, or just find a way to get around it. Like when we had the mayor try to bypass it because of the disaster declaration. So you see a lot of those efforts. So kind of having something like this from the state come down, I think it really means a lot, and it's going to put a lot of these local officials on notice that it is a problem that the state is now taking a very serious stance on it, is really going to push to limit how much they can collect. And I think in the end, it'll benefit all Texans, because you're going to have a severely limited local government. It's going to force them to prioritize.
Well, the state really doesn't have really any direct authority over property taxes, do they? Aren't they levied by the city and the county and other governmental agencies? There's not any property taxes that go straight to the state,
right? There's kind of that end around. They go, local governments, and then the local governments kind of pass up whatever they need to pass up to the state. But yeah, they go strictly to your cities, your counties, your school districts.
Oh, they do pass up something to the state?
Every there's a little bit that goes. I mean, even if you look at kind of like the Robin Hood tax, where the schools
that's
collect
a school district, though.
That's a school
different
district,
than,
right? Yeah, if you
municipal.
Look at,
so I can see where the state has a much more active role in the issue of education, because there's so much that's dependent at the state level and the federal level. But presumably at the municipal level, that would be something that you might think that the state would keep their hands off that, and they wouldn't think it was their prerogative.
Right. When you think so, but when you think about it, I guess it's ultimately the state's job when these local governments do get out of control and do continue to take or just overburden the property taxpayers or just general constituents as a whole. The state sees it as a responsibility to kind of stop that and limit it a little bit, because they do have the ultimate authority over the cities. So I think that's what they're doing here, is trying to exert that authority and say, you guys have been increasing property taxes nonstop for years. I think 195% in 20 years. It's time for some change. It's time for something to happen. So now they're kind of exerting a little bit of that influence and putting cities and school districts, counties, and everybody else on notice.
So I guess they have the constitutional authority to cap municipal revenues in some way or other. Huh?
In some way or other, yeah. And you hear a lot of local officials argue otherwise, though. They say, that they're completely autonomous and they shouldn't have to deal with that. But as we've seen this last session, the state definitely feels differently about that.
There's some other those autonomous issues that are going on right now. I guess the Supreme Court is currently hearing something about the plastic bag ban in Laredo.
I briefly heard about that. I haven't been following that very closely, but I did hear that is going up to the Supreme Court, which is really interesting to see that. I guess I don't understand what the initial argument was to kind of spur that. I guess someone was arguing that the city was violating their right to, have a plastic bag.
Yeah, well, that's right. They were violating the right to have a plastic bag.
Yeah,
a lot of people like plastic bags, and people have made the case that some of the other bags that people are using are really unsanitary and cause problems, and that now some stores, I think, have started to charge you for certain plastic bags. If they're of a certain thickness or something, they can charge you extras because it's not part of the bag.
Yeah, well, we're lucky that we're not California. I actually was just reading an article before that said that they have passed a bill, or either they're in process of passing a bill, that would fine and even at the severest penalty jail waiters or waitresses who offer plastic straws without the customer asking for them, because it is they're kind of, forcing this the plastic straws onto people, and obviously everyone's concerned about the environmental impact of the waste.
Wow.
So I don't know if that passed or if they were just mulling it over, but yeah, we haven't gotten that far yet, which I think is good.
Yeah, well, I listened to thinking last year when I went to that legislative review, there was the issue of plastic bags did come up, and I think the point was, hey, we already have laws against littering. I mean, you throw those plastic bags out, you're subject to a fine or whatever else. And now I know that doesn't work 100% of the time, but I mean, I guess you could almost dovetail that back to gun legislation. I mean, you shouldn't be able to buy guns because, somebody might kill somebody with a gun. Like you shouldn't buy a plastic bag because you might throw it out the window of your car and get caught on these barbed wire fences and it looks like hell when you're driving through the country. But I mean, there's definitely an issue there.
Yeah, once you open that door, it's like, where does it end now?
Exactly. It's hard to make those lines.
Yeah.
But, okay, so that would lower all of the school district and the municipal taxes to an annual increase of 2.5%?
It would limit it. So so they couldn't do an increase that's larger than that without voter approval. So it would have to go to the voters in that district to approve. They have to make the case that they need more money for whatever reason.
See. Okay.
So kind of like Houston's right now, where I think it's population inflation or 4.5%, whichever is lower. And if they want to go above that, they have to bring it to the voters. And I'm sure, if similar to Houston's, if there's a disaster declaration or something like that, there's going to be room there to increase taxes if necessary.
Yeah, okay. Well, was it, I'm not sure I could really say what percentage of Abbott's special session agenda was actually successful from his standpoint. Did he get a majority of things passed, or was it not so good?
I wouldn't say it was too great. I mean, there were things passed. I mean, a few different things, like there was a tree ordinance and just different things that actually did impact.
Cutting down one of your own trees.
Right, right. But what didn't pass were the big things, the significant substantial property tax reform that everybody wanted, the spending caps that people wanted, union dues legislation, school choice, which was a huge one, and people put a lot of effort behind those. So those were kind of the big cornerstone issues going into the regular.
What about ethics?
Ethics reform did not pass either, and that's another huge cornerstone.
Why is there so much? We should know how much of opposition there is to ethics.
Right.
Legislation. What are these guys just such blatant scandals that they just don't want anybody tapping into what they're doing?
Yeah, well, what's funny is a lot of politicians like to pass laws that make the public adhere to them and make the public more transparent, yet they don't like to do it for themselves, unfortunately. So yeah, I mean, it's frustrating because one of the things that I know Governor Abbott was pushing was to end this revolving door of legislators leaving office and automatically using their connections and credibility, if you will, to become lobbyists and then lobby the legislature. You kind of had to take a cooling off period. That's what he wanted, that didn't go through. I mean, we didn't get that, unfortunately, and you still see that happening on a regular basis. And it's frustrating because the public wants their legislators to be accountable, and they want it to be transparent. And ethics is something that should be top of mind. It should be something very simple that we can get past. Everybody should understand and be on the same page there. But unfortunately, they weren't, and we're still sitting here without a significant ethics reform to our state legislature.
Huh. So the group of people that were against that were what? The legislators themselves? Is there some power group or lobby group that doesn't think that that should be a good idea?
Yeah, well, so what we saw was, this group kind of headed up by Joe Straus, the outgoing speaker, and all of his, allies who thwarted not just ethics reform, but most of these reforms that everybody wanted. But, the problem with the ethics reform was that there's been back and forth and accusations over whether it was the Senate's fault or the House's fault or, whose fault it was, or Governor Abbott should have put it on the special session call. But what we saw in the session was that it did pass the Senate, and a bill kind of sat there in Government Ethics Committee, and the chair of that committee just sat there and let it languish, and then passed a very similar bill shortly after that, and that one was sent to the Senate, and now she's saying that, well, they should have just passed my bill and we would have had it done, but the same
Is this a person that has finds themselves opposed by
yes, it is.
one of Abbott's
Yes, it is. And the problem is that shortly after that, she, along with others in that committee, held a press conference saying that the governor needs to take up ethics reform. This is a huge issue, but they had the opportunity to do it during the regular session and did not, and then tried to pressure the governor into moving and adding it to his special call. But he had specific agenda items that he wanted, and he went for that. And the problem with that call was it wasn't even, and I'm not talking about the special session call, but the call to get the governor to put ethics reform on wasn't genuine from these state reps. Actually, one of them is quoted, the same one that Abbott has since endorsed against, was quoted in the Chronicle saying that she held up ethics reform because her bills were not moving in the state Senate. So she was a little frustrated, and I think the Chronicle said it was political retribution or something along those lines. And so you see a lot of those games, and that's why Texans don't have the genuine reforms that they want. It's because of these legislative games.
I see. Oh, very good. Okay, so what changes would we as ordinary taxpayers expect to see if most of these things that Abbott was interested in passing, and they are his group of favored candidates, winds up being elected during the primary?
Yeah.
And of course, they still have the general election to go, so I mean, it's not a drop-dead certainty that anybody that's even backing is even going to make it to Austin, quite frankly. But there's a lot of safe districts, I guess, safe Republican districts, that it will make a difference. So it sounds like there's almost, if that's successful, there could be like a sea change of policy in Austin.
And that's what everybody's saying. That's why everybody's looking at this primary now. With the speaker leaving, it kind of leaves this little bit of a vacuum, if you will. And there's going to be a new speaker who's likely going to be more conservative than the last. And if you see enough changes in these seats, there could be significant policy reforms, policy outcomes of that. So take school choice for instance. We saw that get killed numerous times, and unfortunately, the chair of the Public Education Committee, who was kind of the blockade to school choice, does not have an opponent there's some funny games going on up in Kingwood where he sued to get his opponent off of the ballot, and so there's a lot going on up there. But it seems as though he might be going back, and so if you see significant change in some of these other seats, though, we can see things like school choice, we can see things like property tax reform, which I think Texans would feel almost an immediate impact from. We would see spending caps so that state spending would come down. We would see union dues reform, which was on the special call, which would stop these government agencies from collecting union dues and then remitting them to the public employee unions. So you would see a lot of significant changes that could save money and generate money for Texans by keeping it in their pocket and allowing them to spend it elsewhere. So I think this primary season and then this general election are incredibly important for that reason, because we can see some significant change next legislative session if everybody puts in enough work in these next few months.
Yeah, I see. Well, I mean, things that are like taxpayer relief, I mean, it's kind of you can't consider that to be not a popular issue, but the lobbies against that have to be what? The school district bureaucracies and the municipal bureaucracies and the Texas Municipal League and all these people that are raking the money in every time our appraisal goes up by 10%, our taxes go up by 10%.
Texas Municipal League, Texas Association of Counties, Texas Association of School Boards, Texas Association of School Administrators, all of these kind of niche groups that really exist to further the interests of the elected officials that they represent, that pay their membership dues to this organization. So yeah, those are the people that we see standing in the way of it, and we also see local officials. Our own county judge here in Harris County had testified against the property tax reform measure just because they feel that it would restrain them too much. And unfortunately, I think most people don't find that as a problem when you restrain government a little too much. I think cutting back on how much they're getting, the average person is okay with that. The average person is okay with seeing government get a little bit of less money from them. So you see a lot of these local elected officials, and you see these organizations that represent them out there advocating for against property tax reform. And even, within the city of Houston, when it comes to speaking about property tax reform within City Hall, we've seen, time and time again where they discuss City Hall as if they discuss property tax reform as if it's a joke. I know numerous senior level staff in the mayor's office have equated property tax reform to the cost of a latte, and things like that, as if it wouldn't make a difference to the average person. So,
they always have to pass up 0.003 mil reduction, so that when they get reelected, they say, "Oh, well, we voted for property tax reductions." You're right for your latte reductions. So yeah, you're right. Okay, so I see how that's going. So, will you be planning to get more involved with the legislature then after this primary election, or even the general election season is over? Are you going to stay in the political consulting business?
You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go back to focusing on the city of Houston, writing about what's going on at City Hall, writing about the issues that we deal with here in Harris County and the city of Houston and all of our local suburbs. That's kind of what I want to do. The legislature doesn't interest me as much as what happens locally, because as we often talk about, that's where you feel the biggest impact. That's where you feel the most immediate impact, and that's also where you can have the most change with kind of I wouldn't say less effort, but you see more direct change from the effort that you put in. So I'm going to go back to focusing on that and leave the legislature to the others. They can deal with that. And if there are issues that arise that deal with, the cities and the legislature, I might insert myself into that process. But
I see. Okay. Very
other than
good.
that, I think I'll be focusing here locally.
Oh, well, that's good to hear, I guess. As a fellow Houstonian, I'm glad to see that you're motivated in that direction. What one of the things that's going on with the city of Houston, I guess what's a good segue to talk about, other things that are going on in the city of Houston that you may be getting involved in. But there seem to be quite a number of lawsuits that are proceeding up through the state's docket that would have some tremendous effects on the city of Houston and their ability to raise revenue. And most of them, or not most of them, but several of them have to do with challenging the ballot language that the city uses when there's a proposition on the ballot. They put something on the ballot that can, in some cases, give voters the opinion that's the exact opposite of what is actually being voted for. I know the term limits one is one like that, where they said, "Oh, this is a legislation to limit the terms of whatever consummate."
Right.
So instead of whatever it was, 4, is it 4 now?
Now it's for 2 4-year terms now rather than 3 2-year terms.
Yeah, so really it extended their ability of public service from 6 years to 8 years.
Right.
But it didn't say that in the ballot. It
Right.
says, oh, we're going to limit the thing. And so when anybody usually sees things that said limit this or that, it's fairly popular
right?
with a lot of the voters.
Also, it didn't say on the ballot that some of the elected officials, our city council members who had, I think it was on their first term, would then be eligible for the 2 4-year terms, so therefore could serve 10 years. So they don't tell you things like that. They kept that stuff out of the public discussion. But I mean it's really frustrating because, as you've said, Houston time and time again has done this, kind of dance around the ballot language. Let's kind of, massage the language to get the result that we want. And the Texas Supreme Court has numerous times struck it down and either told them to rewrite the ballot language or call a new election, kind of like with the rain tax provision.
Have they done that now? Is there one case?
Well, the rain tax, they were supposed to call a new election after the Supreme Court said that the language was misleading, and they are still collecting it and have not called a new election.
And the Supreme Court told them to call a new election?
Yes. So they're still collecting it, and the argument there is that City Council, they called for the election for the rain tax, but at the same time they had to pass an ordinance that would have allowed the collection of the taxes. So it was kind of completely different from passing the tax and then the mechanism to collect the tax.
Okay.
So they're saying that since City Council passed that mechanism to collect the tax, it's still in place, so they got to keep collecting it until.
Yeah, I love the way they can do that.
I wish the average person could dance around a court ruling like that.
Yeah. Well, the original objection to the ruling on the rain tax was what? That it wasn't called a tax?
It wasn't. They didn't identify that it was a tax in the ballot language. They said it was a pay-as-you-go fee, and it seemed as though it was kind of a user fee. So it would be your choice if you wanted to use that service and pay the fee. And I think that was the argument from those in the case. And
if you want a sewer going to your house, you
got to pay that
fee.
And I think, and the Supreme Court kind of ruled the same way that they do with most of this language. I think they did it with the HERO ordinance as well, is that it needs to be straightforward and people need to know what they're voting for. And I mean, it shouldn't be hard. If you're voting for a tax, you should be able to read that on the ballot and see you're voting for a tax. It should be clear and transparent. You shouldn't need to go do any research or educate yourself. You should be able to walk into a voting booth and determine what you're voting for or against.
Yeah, I think the same kind of wording came up with this pension bond election that evidently in the fine print on the actual wording of the resolution, as opposed to the wording of the ballot where you read it, there was something in the fine print. It says, oh, by the way, this will repeal the revenue cap tax, revenue caps that previous elections have put on the city of Houston, and therefore it's null and void. The caps don't mean anything anymore.
Right.
So,
Yeah, and that's interesting because I know when they initially brought that issue up, I think it was the Chronicle reported that the mayor's press secretary said, "Oh, that's just boilerplate language. That just goes into all of these." But seemingly it allows for kind of the repeal of the cap to fund whatever payback they have to pay for these bonds. And now, whether that holds up in court or not, I don't know. I'm not an attorney, but it certainly seems, if you read the language just for what it is, that it is kind of wide open there, and that they're able to do that. So it's going to be interesting to see how that case proceeds. They allowed the city to continue with the sale of the bonds because the case was brought up kind of shortly before the bonds were sold. I think it might have been within the same week or something. So they let that go forward. But I do believe they are going to still hear that case and take it to trial, and I'm excited to see what happens with that.
yeah, the revenue cap couldn't be violated without a vote by the people.
Right.
And so if you don't tell them when they're voting for something that, oh, by the way, this is a repeal of the revenue cap that you voted for 4 years ago, that's got to be underhanded, to say the least.
Right. And what's interesting is that, they argue that isn't what they were trying to do, but just months before that...
just an unintended consequence.
Right,
Yes.
Right. But just months before that, they made the attempt to repeal it, when after Hurricane Harvey, and Turner said, we're going to, increase taxes because we have this window to do so because of the disaster declaration.
And he dropped that.
Yeah, and then he dropped that after the public backlash.
Because they told him he could put it in the print on the
he found a new way to do it.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Oh, wow, that's pretty bad. Well, in that original, what was that called, the HERO ordinance? Was that another misleading language thing that they put forward?
What was interesting with that was that they passed it, and then a group of activists did a petition to repeal it, I believe, and they had enough signatures. They submitted them to the city secretary. City secretary validated them and then invalidated them, and it turns out that the mayor had struck a number of the signatures because of one reason or another. They took her to court, determined that signatures were valid, and when they went to go create...
This is Anna Russell they took her to court?
No, they took the city of Houston and Mayor Turner to court.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I'm sorry, not Mayor Parker to court.
Oh.
And won, and it said that the signatures were indeed valid, and they had to move forward with an election. And when they did that and began crafting that ballot language, and I remember I was sitting in City Hall the day that they were doing this. They voted on the ballot language, and Andy Taylor came to speak at City Hall, and he said, this language that you have here, it's misleading, and it's not going to hold up in court. And the Mayor Parker made some rude statement to Taylor, and next thing you know, they ended up taking the city to court over the language before the vote actually happened, and the court ruled in their favor, saying that yes, this language is misleading. And I believe what it was that with the original language, if you would have voted yes, it meant no, and no meant yes.
Yeah.
So they were saying that yes means to mean yes, and no means to mean no. It has to mean no. So it was just another attempt to try to thwart the voters and get what they want without actually telling them what they were going for.
There's also a couple of, I guess, propositions that seemingly had enough signatures to qualify, and yet the city decided to sit on them and not validate the fact that they were valid, and those signatures were in 3-4 months before the election ever. And I think one of them had to do with changing the pensions for the city of employees to a defined contribution plan as opposed to a defined benefit plan. And as far as I know, that issue is still sitting there at the city, and the minute they say, oh yeah, there's enough signatures there, that has to go on the ballot for a defined contribution plan.
Still sitting there till this day. I mean, I think it was maybe March or April of last year that those petitions were submitted, and I can't even recall how many signatures they had, but I believe it was like 30,000 or something along those lines. And And the city said that they didn't have the manpower to do it then, and it was taking too long, and it was just they were validating. I even, this is when I was still fully working for Empower Texans, and over the course of from when they were submitted until probably September of 2017, emailing the city secretary asking for the status, and it was always, oh well, they're being validated, and never validated. We're still waiting to see what happens. And yeah, if once those are validated, it's going to have to be an election. And what's frustrating about it is that frustrating for the firefighters. That's the other petition you mentioned. They submitted one as well that would have asked for a pay parity, and their petition's still sitting there too. So you've got these petitions, and it doesn't seem as though the city is taking any interest in pushing those forward, which is kind of their ministerial duty once those are submitted. I mean, it's every citizen has a right to petition their government, but here in Houston, we're just sitting here waiting until the government gets ready to.
Yeah, it's incredible what they seemingly get away with in terms of just violating what supposedly is the standard rules for doing these things. I know of some folks that worked on some, like they had in Houston, red light camera issues, and you can, some folks in some of the smaller outgoing suburban jurisdictions that put those in front of this council with the signatures, and council said, well, we don't think we're going to put that on the ballot. Sue us. Well, most of these groups that just had a few, it wasn't an onerous signature requirement. You only need 500 signatures, so you can get a half a dozen people together and do it.
Right.
Well, they weren't prepared to start dipping into their deep pockets to try to move this case up, as the cities keep delaying it and putting more issues in front of you and so forth. So you can wind up spending a heck of a lot of money and maybe not ever get it back, even with attorney's fees. So there's a lot of ways that these people in power have a way of dulling whatever the effect that as a citizen you think you might be pushing forward.
Right. It's frustrating because you have activists who get together and do that, who in their free time get together and do petition drives and try to push forward efforts, and the average activist doesn't have the money to fight a city like Houston as they drag it out in court.
Although Kubash did, right?
Right, exactly. But I mean, and it's ridiculous because they will do that. You can be completely within your rights and be completely correct, and they will just drag it out and drag it out and drag it out until eventually you just don't have the money to continue fighting. And I mean, that's why it kind of takes that effort for a number of people to get together to.
And it's your money they're using.
Exactly, they're using your money to spend your money. So it's incredibly frustrating seeing it happen, and you just want your government to be kind of more to be responsive and transparent, but yet they're trying to fight you and spending your money to do so.
Yeah. Wasn't there some effort, and I don't remember where it was, but you might be aware of it from a state standpoint, up in Williamson County, they were trying to put a measure, I guess it actually was approved somewhere or other, where the county, I don't know if it was a county or a city, I think it was a county, they were not going to be allowed to use taxpayer dollars to lobby the state government for their, whatever, the county's business. So, I mean, that's another issue of, if you can't get the voters to pass what you want, we'll just pay our lobbyists in Austin to go around and do it anyway, and then that way we'll get it done. So.
Yeah, wow. No, I hadn't heard of that one. That's, I mean, and that kind of, sparks something in my mind. Maybe we should try that here. We should try that. No, I hadn't heard that one. But yeah, I mean, that's another thing. Yeah, you can't get it, you can't get your citizens to approve something. So yeah, you take your tax-funded lobbyists and then your groups of lobbyists, like your
whatever,
Texas Association of Counties.
Texas counties,
and
like $25,000, $50,000 a year.
Exactly.
Oh yeah, we just pay that as our member fee.
Right, exactly.
Right.
And then you go and just advocate for what you want at the legislature and get it that way. I mean, it's it's ridiculous how many ways that they have an ability to kind of get your end around getting around the taxpayers. I mean, it's crazy. I heard a story of can't recall which county it is, but out in South Texas, where a number of citizens wanted to petition their government for a rollback election because the county had increased the taxes too much, and they, instead of just being honest about it, as I guess you can't really say most governments are, but instead of just being honest about it, they fudged the numbers and kind of lost papers and did all this stuff to kind kind of throw the taxpayers off and say that they didn't increase it beyond the rollback rate, so therefore you could not call for an election. And they sued the county, and I know that the case may still be going on, but originally the judge ruled in their favor, saying that the county did, lie and falsify information to get away with taxing you more than they should have. And I think the county appealed, and now they're still in this back and forth fight, but that's out in South Texas. I wouldn't be surprised if that happens all over the state.
Yeah, wow. Interesting. Yeah. So, yeah, once you're in charge of the books, all kinds of interesting things start to happen. I know.
Right.
So, I guess we're kind of exhausting these municipal and state issues. What do you have commentary on the national scene these days? Anything to share with us on that going on?
Not so much. I try to follow it, but it's just it's a completely different beast.
Circus,
and
for
it is
sure.
a circus. Yeah, 100% a circus. So I think to keep my sanity is when I try to continue to focus on the local and the state level, because the national is just absurd. It's absurd. But I know you're involved with a lot of stuff. So what are your thoughts?
I try not to get too involved with that stuff.
Yeah, I don't blame you.
But there's a couple of Republican legislators that are, Ted Poe is retiring.
Right.
And so that's an open seat in Harris County.
Yeah.
Any other people that are, there's open seats coming in Harris County?
Not so much in Harris County that I'm aware of, but I know that Ted Poe race is, it's really a hot race. They've got, I think, 9 candidates running in the Republican primary to replace him, and that's likely where it's going to be decided because of the way the county is shaped. The district is shaped. They have, it's a very odd U shape that goes around Harris County, but they have areas like Humble and Kingwood, Atascocita, so very solidly conservative areas. So it seems that that's going to be decided in the primary. But it's a 9-way race. You have some very, very interesting candidates in the race. I'm really excited to watch that one and see what happens there. I actually live in the district, so I'm watching it very closely. So I'm excited about that one.
Okay. Well, is there anything really, though, that when you say you live in the district, so you're watching it closely, well, presumably so you can vote.
Right.
But what, the ability of these legislators to actually cause something to happen that would be beneficial to you and your district?
Not so much, and that's
I don't have much interest in keeping up with my representative.
Right.
He's kind of irrelevant, as a matter of fact. He's going to do where the power is being brokered down through the channels.
And it's like you go to a lot of these forums and they talk about the community issues, but really what the issues that they want to talk about and the issues that they're going to affect are things like national security and defense policy and tax policy and all things that don't necessarily have an immediate or direct impact on us living in the district. So yeah, that's it's interesting to follow it, but yeah, they seem so far removed, and they really are so far removed and focusing on issues that just do not directly impact my life. But
exactly, that's a problem. And of course,
I
think it's generally recognized that the distance between where the decisions are being made about things that affect your life and there's such a gulf of people and barriers and influence between that you very little.
And that's why
very little influence over what's really going on.
And it's true, and that's why I always can encourage people to get involved more locally. Whether it's the city council or the county or even the state legislature, because I feel like you have a much greater impact there. You can call your congressman, but even if you call them 100 times, you're very likely not going to get through, and you're not going to make a huge difference on whatever vote they're about to take. So unless you get you and maybe 500 of your friends to start calling. So, but that's not the same when you're talking about city council members. In most instances, and your state legislators. So, that's why I think it's so important to stay involved locally, because you can actually have that impact. And it's frustrating because you always see people, watching, CNN and Fox News and complaining about what's going on there, and wanting to go to DC for the fight. And it's like, we have fights right here that you can invest your energy and your efforts into, and actually have a change. And I'd love to see more of that. I'd love to see people actually get involved on that level, because that's where the real change happens, in my opinion.
One of the guests that I've had here in the past, actually, I think we just mentioned him earlier, Carl Jarvis wrote his book that he had, The U.S. of Dysfunction or something like that. But the whole book was about changing the way senators are elected. Instead of having direct election of U.S. senators, that it repealed the, whatever, I'm going to miss what the amendment was,
Right.
switched to the direct election of U.S. senators. But before the direct election of U.S. senators, they used to be elected by state legislatures. Well, the whole bundle of issues that your senator from your state is going to be interested in are going to be a lot different if the legislatures in the state legislature are the ones that's sending him there, or if the general public multimedia, multi-mega million-dollar campaigns are trying to influence the general public into thinking that they really have something to do with it.
Right,
But
right. It's true.
it was really one of those things that seemingly administrative reform, and I guess there were a number of states that had their Senate seats were vacant in Washington. They weren't, all the senators weren't there because the states were deadlocked on electing on who they were going to elect.
Right, right.
But I think looking back at the foresight of our founders and all, that probably was a better kind of an ongoing regimen to impose, because it pushed all those decisions back down to the state level and the local level, instead of making everybody having to be a millionaire before they can run for a U.S. senator.
Right. I mean, and it's interesting because if you think about it, say our state legislature is picking it, whether it's the state house with 150 people or the state senate with 31, that's a very small amount of people, and you're going to want to make sure you're doing the right thing, because one vote can change everything if you were a senator.
Yeah.
And, I look to my home state, New Jersey, we have, I don't live there anymore. They have Senator Bob Menendez, who is embroiled in this corruption scandal and has been for a very long time, but yet the guy has consistently gotten reelected, even with kind of this air of corruption that's been around him for years. And why is it? Because, you have an incredibly dense state and people just still vote for him. But I bet you if he was directly accountable to the state legislature, either one, he wouldn't have been involved with what he was involved with, or two, he would have been gone a long time ago.
Yeah.
So it's hard, when you're looking at, millions of people that someone has to convince to support them. And, when you have that base and that tight base, you're just going to continue to get reelected. So, I mean, I'd love to see some of those guys removed, and maybe a state legislature would do it faster than the general public.
Yeah, I think, who was it in Illinois? Rostenkowski.
Oh,
he was elected from jail. He was in jail when he was elected.
Yes, it's, absolutely absurd. It's crazy.
I don't know if we have any of those in Texas or not. But,
hopefully not. Hopefully not.
Anyway. All right. Well, I don't know. We can delve into whatever. I guess we could delve into the case for optimism for 2018.
Right.
So are you pretty optimistic about the taxpayers coming out ahead in the next year and the next legislature? I guess we're really working, since the legislature doesn't meet this year, everybody's kind of ramping up for the 2019 session.
Yeah. So
okay.
it is incredibly exciting. I am very optimistic about it, both on the state and local level. I'm excited to see what happens in 2018, November 2018, and March 2018.
Yeah.
But then going into January 2019, heading into the session, I think we're going to see a big difference than last session. I mean, we went into last session so divided. It was just, you had the factions, and you had some folks fighting for solid, good reforms, while other folks are fighting to stop them. So I'm real excited to go into that with, a new speaker, fresh faces in the legislature. I mean, there seems to be a number of races that are all but decided. I mean, there's one up in Dallas County where the incumbent this time around only raised $60,000, and his opponent raised, I think it's over 200. So the likelihood of her heading to the legislature is very high. So I think we see a lot of these changes happening, and I'm excited to see what legislation comes out of that. I think regardless of, or at least I hope, regardless of what we get out of the next session, it's going to be more than what we got out of the last one. I mean, if we get, one of those kind of cornerstone pieces of legislation through, both chambers and signed by the governor, I would think it'd be a success. I mean, and even the same thing can be said about locally, whether the term limit lawsuit succeeds or not, we've got a local election coming up in I think it's 2019. So, everybody's going to be starting to gear up for that. So I'm excited to see what happens there as well. So yeah, I think there's a lot to be optimistic about. So it should be a really fun year heading into this election and into the next legislative session. So hopefully we get some good reforms out of it.
What do these state representatives and senators do during the year that they're not in session? Are they just always working for their next election? Is that what they work on? Their
Seems
campaign?
like it, right? It seems like it. I mean, luckily, I guess some people would say luckily, others wouldn't. There was a special session, so we forced them to work for a little longer this year. But right after that, it seems they just head into campaign season and just start campaigning and, show up at the chambers of commerce and show up at the local groups and kind of talk about how successful their session was.
So during this time when there is no session, are these, and of course some of them don't even know whether they're going to be back for the next session.
Right.
But what do they do? Huddle up with all their lobbyists and try to write the bills for the next session? Is there a lot of that going on now as we...
I think so, and I mean, I think you see that because once the session kicks off, you see a lot of, and again, I haven't worked there, but you hear about a lot of the aides kind of lined up out of some of these legislative offices with just the bills that their senator or representative is ready to file, so they can get kind of lower numbers and get those bills, through faster and things like that. So yeah, I mean, it seems as though they're kind of going to these conferences like the Texas Association of Counties and all these other things, and kind of working with the people who are working against the taxpayers and trying to figure out what legislation.
Yeah, what else can we
find out what
voiced on these people
exactly.
Oh,
see what they can concoct during this during the interim.
Maybe Mark Twain wasn't totally right when he says nobody's life or liberty is safe when the legislature's in session.
I agree.
It's not safe when they're out of session either.
Exactly.
They're all working behind the scenes trying to get into the next session.
Right.
So,
but what you do see from some of our good legislators, what you do see, and I wouldn't even say good, but a lot of the legislators, they are doing kind of interim hearings and different things like that. So I believe there was one just announced, I believe it's going to be hosted by Senator Betancourt somewhere in the A-Leaf area to kind of talk about flooding and property taxes and reappraisals and all of those things. So you see a lot of these interim hearings, and even the last interim, you saw a steady flow of property tax hearings around the state. I know when they had the one in Houston, they had at City Council, the chamber was packed, and they want to hear from citizens so that they can put that input into what legislation they're going to craft. So that's kind of what helped build that property tax reform bill last session. Unfortunately, it didn't succeed, but that's what was put into that. So you do see a lot of these interim hearings with them, kind of like listening sessions for the constituents and hearing what the concerns are, what issues need to be looked at, and what areas need to be reformed.
I see. So, given the, do some of those issues come to the forefront during the election, even though it's like, oh well, if you elect me, here's some of the things that I'm going to be working for you for the next when we get back in session next whatever March or whenever it is. So they can still run on some of these bills that aren't even. I mean, they run on issues, I guess. They're not bills yet, but the issue is, I'm going to enter this bill to limit property taxes to 2.5%. So therefore, vote for me, even though it's not, the bill isn't in the hopper yet. But if you want,
I promise you it will be. That's what they say, right? Look, I promise you it will be. But I think it works both ways. So they're running on what bill they may pass, but a lot of them are also running from what bills they voted for or they passed because they don't want to be held accountable to them, or for bills they didn't vote for and voted against. So a lot of them are running from kind of their records. So you do see that coming into the forefront. I mean, this cycle, from every race I've heard about across the state, the issue that everybody's been talking about is property tax reform, and the fact that it died because it made such big headlines. Every news organization was talking about it. The House adjourned a day early. There was so much just discourse and anger and war of words and op-eds and all. There's just so much surrounding all of it that it really drew a lot of attention. And you hear in a lot of these primary races that everyone's talking about property tax reform, either hitting the incumbents on the way they voted on it or didn't vote on it, or they're running on the fact that they want to vote on, maybe the governor's new plan or something even, further than that. So you do see these issues in the forefront in these primaries. And I think it's good because you get to hear the dialogue, the constituents get heard. And I think, you get these statements. My former boss, Michael Quinn Sullivan, often talks about how you got to hold elected officials accountable to what they run on, and a lot of people forget to do that. So what you hear now is that everybody says that they want to be the property tax reformer, or they want to be the person who's going to cut spending, or want to do all of these things. But you need to remember that rhetoric during the legislative session, and you need to hold them accountable to that. So I think it offers a great opportunity when these issues are coming to the forefront for people to pay attention, to listen, to kind of do their own research and see how that legislator voted, but also to hold them accountable when the time comes.
Well, that's probably pretty smart of Abbott then to put out some position papers ahead of time, so he is not just springing that on the people that have been elected.
Right.
They can actually incorporate that into their campaign, so that when the time comes, everybody can be on the same page.
Right, and not even that. So the 2.5% cap is it's a very strong cap. I mean, it's a low amount that they can increase you, which is better for the taxpayers. But if you're out there now and you're not saying that you're going to support it, it's like, so okay, so you don't support limiting property taxes. But if you are out there saying you are going to support it, well, guess what? They're going to hold you accountable to that when the session comes now too.
Yeah.
So it's great to have that out there. It's great for him to put out a piece of potential legislation and have people have something they can sink their teeth into, and have something that constituents can get excited about and can actually, talk to their legislators and candidates and get them on board with it. And if not, then they can, vote for somebody else.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't know. I think we've just pretty much been able to go through most of the issues that I had. Any closing remarks that you'd like to? We want to encourage the voters to get more informed about what's going on, or
yeah, always. I mean, I definitely always tell and always want to tell people to continue to get more informed, get your news from various sources. I'd be remiss if I didn't say visit empowertexans.com, because they have a ton of great information about the legislature when it's in session, and the campaigns when they're out of session, and just what lawmakers are doing, and and get your news from various sources, and always verify it and listen to the candidates, hold them accountable, and make sure you vote. That's the most important part.
do you find that the social media environment now is changing the way campaigns are being run, and maybe the outcome of campaigns? In other words, the person with the biggest media budget is not necessarily the ones that are getting out to touch on a individual basis,
Yeah.
the actual voters.
I think so, and I think
So it's cheaper to actually be a more visible candidate now than it's been in the past.
right. It's cheaper, and it allows your word to get spread so easily. I mean, you can now take, in an instant, a clip from the legislative session of you fighting for something and put it on your Twitter, on your Facebook, and instantly share it to thousands of people, rather than, clipping something and cutting it and making it into a TV ad and all this other stuff. So now you can really share what you want to say. You can share, videos, pictures, whatever the case may be, policy proposals, and really reach a wider audience and really gain that support. But also for the activists, it's good too, because when they're, following the legislative session, you don't need to be in Austin to reach your legislator. You can just kind of tweet them. And there are a lot of activist groups that have worked on kind of doing these, I forgot what they call them, but they're pretty much tweet storms. Essentially, they get all of them tweeting the same
I guess
thing.
our current president has popularized the tweeting storms, hasn't he?
Yes, certainly.
Whatever, so.
But yeah, and they can all just kind of hone in on one person and encourage them to vote for or against something, or take a look at something. So I think social media is extremely beneficial to the legislative process now, but as well as to the campaign process.
Yeah, not only that, if you get in there with some kind of a teaser that gets you can always have links to other things. So if the people that are really interested in that particular topic can branch out and look at all kinds of other impacts or groups that are either supporting or not supporting this particular point of view.
Right.
So you can, it's a lot easier to be a lot more informed as a voter than it used to be. we used to have, if the League of Women Voters didn't tell you about it, you knew very little about what was going on. So they went. Well, anyway, Charles, it's been a pleasure to have you here tonight, and I certainly appreciate you coming in and visiting with us. And so we'll just sign off for this edition of Public Affairs Public Access, and hope some of our viewers will join us again. Maybe next, actually, I think the next time we have a thing is in March, March 15th or so, and maybe you can come back and visit us again then.
Would love to.
Thanks for being
having me.
here.
Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you.